we were able to spend some good time with boys, and my daughter joined us a little bit. So at Myrtle Beach, we didn't get in the ocean. We just kind of played in the sand a little bit and put her feet in the pool a couple of times. But other than that, just time away was good. Yeah, the Atlantic Ocean, I'm not big on that. It's kind of nasty. So, but it was, it's a nice flat beach, and like I say, it's a change of scenery. The trip back wasn't much fun, though. 2 hours trying to get through Asheville, and drive a person like me a little bit batty. So my wife, we've got our 45th anniversary coming up. She wants to go back that direction, for a few days, and I'm like, I'm not sure I want to. So we'll see. Yeah, excuse me? That's what I'm saying. Yeah, I've got to figure out a way to, I don't know. Maybe I can get sick or something. I don't know. I'll figure out something. Yeah. We'll see what happens with that one. But I would be fit to be tied to be driving, that many hours on my anniversary and Father's Day at the same time, coming back. So we'll see what happens. So we're continuing to study from the cast of the cross, and we've studied lots of folks that were there, the prophets, what they had to say about it, Judas Iscariot, the Jewish rulers, Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate, Simon the Cyrene, the women, Jesus Christ, the thief, John, and now, today, we're going to consider the centurion. Next week, we'll look at Joseph of Arimathea, and the following week, we'll be in here, but we'll be doing singing. Our class ends next week. So got to endure me 2 more classes. How's that? You're almost there. Tonight, we're going to talk about the centurion. And has kind of been my custom. The author normally introduces the subject with a short narrative. I've been reading those because to me they're written nicely and kind of sums up what the lesson will be about. So let me do that again tonight. Never in his lifetime had the centurion seen anything like this. It had been dark for 3 hours. Torches were needed to light the area, despite the fact that it was only the 9th hour. Added to this strangeness was the manner in which Jesus died. At the instant in which he cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last, an earthquake shook the ground they were standing on. It was as if he had summoned it with his dying breath. But the thing that struck the centurion the most was the demeanor of his charge throughout his torturous death. This prisoner was different from the bloodthirsty criminals and rebellious slaves he had executed countless times before. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When his accusers spat, he did not spit back. And when he suffered, he did not threaten. He kept entrusting himself to his Father, whom the centurion heard him petition several times while he was hanging on the cross. The centurion had the feeling that Jesus had the power to change his situation, but he chose not to. He was standing face to face with Jesus when he died. The impact of this filled the centurion with an overwhelming feeling of admiration, so much that he had to exclaim, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Well, let's see if I can do this. I got it on the green. Yeah. Yeah, we can do that if you don't mind. Okay. I think Jeremy's having some trouble with this one. There we go. You moved it though. Okay. All right, the centurion. It seems that in general, wicked men often employ the henchmen to do their dirty work. Somebody wants somebody taken out of this world, then they employ someone else to do it. They don't get their hands dirty, it seems. That was kind of the case with the Jewish rulers at the time. They employed the centurion plus 3 other soldiers to put Jesus to death. And tonight we're going to consider how they did that and consider this centurion and what the events of this day did to change his life. Change. So who were the centurions? We've heard that term. We hear it throughout the New Testament. But what was a centurion? Anybody have a definition for me there? I know some do. Right, someone in charge, a military person, in charge of about 100. That's what's therefore the word centurion. Soldiers, right? Someone to be respected? Was it a? As far as the military is concerned, that's true. It turns out that Roman legions were made up of about 6,000 men. And these legions were divided into cohorts, and normally there were like 10 cohorts per legion, so that means each cohort would have about 600 men. And then there were 6 centuries in each cohort, so that means each century would have about 100 men. And of course, centurions, as the name implies, were in charge of these centuries, and they would drill them in, they would inspect them, they would lead them, they would lead them when they're in the field and also lead them when they're in the camp. They had command over about 100 men. So it was a person who was accomplished, who was obviously a really good soldier, and someone that would command the respect of the soldiers as well as those that were civilians. Next slide. The Roman soldiers were very hardened men. They were tough guys. Who would you compare them to today when you think about somebody that's military and also above and beyond? Navy SEALs come to mind. You know, the guys that went in and got Osama bin Laden. You know, went in and dinged him. You know what I mean? That was the job that he had to do, and he did it. For some, I guess me included, that would have been a tough job. It'd be hard for me to do at this point in my life. But the Roman soldiers were definitely very hardened men. It's said that the Roman soldier was part of like a machine that ate and drank only in order to function. The machine required no pleasure and would feel nothing and flinch from nothing. So whatever it was instructed to do, it would carry out without flinching. The Roman soldier would neither feel guilty nor mercy. He would kill simply because he was ordered. It does remind you of a Navy SEAL or someone, Army Ranger, a tough guy. Or, I don't know, maybe the Hamas folks that went over there and did whatever they did in Israel. They had a mission. They went over there and killed it out, apparently without second thoughts. Next slide, please. It's said that the Roman soldiers were capable of all kinds of cruelty. They were ice cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless killing machines. So can you see, I know they depict it on TV, they come running in on horses, and the populace is afraid of them. And they're all dressed up in all this garb and gear and looking sharp. And at least the way it's depicted in the movies, they were kind of wise guys, and they would kind of throw their weight around. But can you imagine what that looked like to folks that didn't have all that armor and didn't have all those weapons? It'd be a fearful sight to have those guys come into town. And they were, the Roman soldiers knew that, okay? So they pushed themselves around a little bit. It's no wonder that Roman soldiers were put in charge of killing Jesus. there was a centurion. We don't know his name. I think there's a name that's been mentioned through tradition, but I don't know what that was. I just noticed that. And 3 accomplices. So the Jews, if Jesus was going to be killed, it had to be done in reality by somebody, and that happened to be the centurion with his 3 Roman soldiers. So next slide, please. Yeah, so how did they kill Jesus? We've kind of talked about this, but it's good to look at it again. First, they scourged him. You recall what that involved? To scourge Jesus?
A whipping that we cannot imagine.
A whipping?
Yep.
Okay.
It's a leather implement, has several tails. Usually the tips, there are pieces of metal that are twisted, and they come back into a handle, and its only purpose is to incur damage physically to another human being.
Okay. That's good. Well said. So they scourged him. They stripped him of his clothes in order to do this. Another way to humiliate him. So then they tied him to a post so he couldn't get away, couldn't move, and then they whipped him. And it's like you say, something fashioned with leather thongs to the ends which attached iron balls and sharp bits of sheep bone. So some of us have had a switching or a whooping with a belt. I don't think we do that so much these days, but most of the older ones have, gotten enough mischief where we deserve that. And we know what kind of marks those would leave, all right? But nothing like this that would cut and bruise and damage flesh. So the first thing the Roman soldiers did to Jesus was they scourged him, stripped him of his clothes, tied him to a post, and then beat his back. After the scourging, next slide please, they stripped Jesus a second time. And this is something I didn't really realize how many times they actually stripped him of his clothes. Apparently so they could do more damage to his flesh, but also just to humiliate him. He's no different than us. He didn't want to be out in front of everybody with no clothes on. Well, they did that to him, and they put a scarlet robe on him in mockery. And he twisted a crown of thorns together and pressed it into his head and put a reed in his hand. And this crown of thorns, you've seen some of these thorn bushes. I'm talking about these sharp thorns, or even a bramble, when you try to get that out of your yard, the blackberry bush. Those things hurt. But the crown of thorns that we're thinking of was wrapped around and put on his head. Even to lightly put it on his head would have been very painful, I think. But more than likely, they pushed it on his head so that it was able to dig into the flesh and stay there. And of course, with that, the blood started dripping and flowing from his head. And any of us have been cut their head, when you were a kid. You know how much your face and head bleeds. It seems like it bleeds more so than other parts of your body. Now that I'm on Eliquis, I can't imagine how it would bleed. Yeah, that's right. So I mind my P's and Q's, so don't have to go through that kind of torment. And then they called together the whole battalion. Okay, here's another effort to humiliate him further. The whole battalion, which was probably 200 to 600 men, and they knelt before him in mockery, "O you King of the Jews." So and he's taken all this without saying anything back. Next slide, please. I don't know if I'm on the right slide or not. Can't see. They spat on him. They slapped him. They struck him in the head with their hands. And so what happens? The thorns dig deeper into his scalp. And when they were finished with this humiliation, what did they do? They stripped him again, 4 times in all, put his clothes back on him and led him away to crucify him. He's been through an awful lot of torment here. We haven't even talked about some of the torment that happened before the Romans got to him. There was a lot of that. Yes.
Then they also kind of blindfold him and slap him, and some prophesied who slapped him in terms of humiliating him in terms
Yeah.
that if he's the Savior, tell us who slapped him.
Oh, yeah. I'm
Humiliation.
yeah, that would be, that would sure do it. If you're all that, then what about this? Yeah. Challenging him in every way. But the mockery with so many people, okay, I don't think I had heretofore really realized that until we just took it step by step, personally. Next slide. I might be a little ahead of myself. But anyway, once they reached the place of execution, they stripped Jesus for a fourth and final time. 4 times they stripped him of his clothes. What's the significance of that? Why would they? It could only be to humiliate him. Why else would they do it? And that's just plain outright mean and cruel. But it was the Roman soldiers doing it. That was no big deal to them. That's what they were charged to do, and they carried out those orders. And then he was literally nailed to the cross with spikes. Now, these spikes were tapered iron spikes. They were about 5 to 7 inches long. That's about 5 or 7 inches. About 3/8 of an inch across, like a square. So anyway, it's a big nail. We probably don't have any of those in our inventory at home. Big nail. And they nailed his hands, the Bible says. Now, the hand was referred to as anything probably below here, all the way to your fingertips. But more than likely, the nails were driven, above the wrist. They say through the 2 bones of your forearm. What is that? I forget. I used to know the bones. The radius and the ulna. Is that it? It just came back to you. When you get older, you try to remember stuff. It takes you about 15 seconds for it to come back, or it's sometimes longer. But at one time I knew that. So anyway, so they nailed that. All right, and then with the feet, they would have crossed the feet and nailed a nail right through both of them. Normally, the feet were on top of each other. So can you imagine how many people stepped on a nail as a kid? Remember, it seemed like there was all the time 2 before some nails sticking out of them. We ran around a lot in our bare feet. We go barefooted onto the, kind of on into the fall. It seemed. But to step on a board with a nail was hurtful. You know what I mean? But to have it driven through your feet that way, your hands, would have been terrible. Next slide, please. Then, of course, they hoisted it, they set the cross up. And there's a pre-dug hole there, and they let it fall more than likely into it. And can you imagine how that felt as it hit the bottom? And, all the stress right here and on your feet as that took place. It's bound to have shot just excruciating pain throughout his body. As a strange courtesy, Jesus was offered a mixture of wine and myrrh to deaden the pain. So wine and myrrh to deaden the pain. I always thought that they offered him that because it was probably nasty, stuff you wouldn't want to drink. But the author suggests that it was a unexpected gesture to maybe to help deaden the pain. But what did Jesus do?
He turned it aside first.
Mm-hmm.
He took it the second.
Yep. Yep. But he basically refused taking part. Why would he have done that?
To fulfill prophecy.
And the prophecy being?
Okay, I'm claiming your stats of memory. I can't remember all of them.
Okay. All right. Well, he basically had signed up for this and said, I will suffer for you. So in my mind, to do something to alleviate that full suffering, would be contrary to, what he was sent to do. And he chose basically a different cup than the cup of wine. He chose a cup of suffering on our behalf. Next slide, please. And so while all this was happening, here's these soldiers. So they take them it's almost like them sitting, spreading out their lawn chairs and watching the people on the cross die, because they weren't dead yet. So with cruel indifference, the men began to divide Jesus' clothing among themselves. And the author suggests that this was part of their compensation, according to Roman law. Now, I can't imagine how Jesus' clothes would have been worth that much. It suggests that he probably was just wearing 5 pieces of clothing: a belt, sandals, an outer robe, a headpiece, and an undergarment. And the undergarment being a seamless tunic reaching from the shoulders to the knees. I guess just one piece of cloth with a hole in it, maybe. I don't know. Yes?
I'm thinking that's might be the reason why they stripped Jesus so much. They didn't want to get the clothing all torn up, because it seems like it was a custom for them to be able to gather the clothing of some of the crucified.
Okay.
So when you go through all the different times they changed, they stripped them. It was like before they went them,
Mm-hmm.
before they did this and did that. It seems like it was for the purpose of preserving the clothing, so that later on, I guess, they started building lots.
Yeah. Yep, for the 5th piece of clothing, because they divided the 4 pieces among them, they cast lots for the 5th piece, which is the undergarment. And why did they do that? Well, they weren't going to cut it up, you know what I'm saying? And so cast lots. But also we learned from John, they did this because this was a fulfillment of prophecy, that they would cast lots for his garments. So that indeed took place as prophesied. Next slide. Next, they waited on those on the cross to die. You know, they've done all what they planned to do. Now just watch it happen. And we learn in Luke that the soldiers again mocked Jesus more. Luke 23, verses 36 to 37. So even though he was there, hanging on a cross, wasn't going anywhere, writhing in pain, they still were cruel enough to continue to mock him. Go ahead.
A lot of the commentators, when they comment about crucifixion, said that crucifixion was a very, very slow death. That I guess normally it would take maybe a couple of days before they would die.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure what the soldiers would be waiting for that early.
Mm-hmm.
When they found that Jesus was already dead, they were kind of surprised about that.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, we're going to touch on that as we go forward. Good point. Sure is. So the Jews requested of Pilate that something be done to hasten the death of the folks on the cross. Do you know why that was?
They wanted him to know Passover.
Yes, sir. Because the Passover was coming. And they requested that Pilate instruct them to do something to hasten the death. And that's where we get into what you're speaking of, the breaking of legs and that sort of thing. And yes, death by crucifixion was designed to be long and torturous. And it's said that typically someone who was crucified would die within, say, 36 hours. So that's a day and a half, right? 24 hours in a day. And this explains why when they went to Pilate to make this request, this explains why later Pilate was so surprised to learn that Jesus was already dead. All right? Because he died in a matter of just 6 hours. Of course, I don't know that they beat the criminals, the thieves beside him, and did all those mean things to them that they did to Jesus. So he was, like I say, halfway dead when they nailed him to the cross. How did most crucifixion victims die? What caused their death?
They break their legs,
Mm-hmm.
and then they ain't got no support, so they smother.
All right, they smothered. A big word here is asphyxia, and I guess that's asphyxiation. I can spell it, but can't say it. Anyway, yeah, so they're here. They're tired. You know, for a little while, I guess they could move up to get a breath, and then they, you know, as they got more and more tired and they lost more and more blood, it became more and more difficult to get up to where they could get a breath. And then when they broke the legs, they could no longer do that. So they're in this position here where they can't breathe and they smother to death. Impossible to exhale while hanging in this position. Thus, the breaking of their legs by the soldiers would ensure a quicker death. And they did break the legs of the two thieves, right? I wonder how they broke them. I mean, they just go. I'm thinking they took something like a baseball bat and whacked them, don't you? Huh. Can you imagine that? My wife watches some of this crime stuff on TV, you know, where they're trying to figure out. If I'm ever missing, you know, go. I won't say that. But it just gets me, some of these murders are committed with a baseball bat or something like that, or a blunt object, and I think, man, that's so terrible. I would hate to be beaten to death with a baseball bat. So that's what they did. They probably got a lot of joy in breaking the legs of these people with however they did it. But they broke their legs. But when they got to Jesus, guess what? He was already dead. So what good would it do to break his legs? Didn't need to do that to hasten his death. But instead, what did they do? What did one of the soldiers do? Pierced his side. And what came forth? Fountain of water and blood. Why do you think the guy, if Jesus was dead, felt so inclined to pierce him with a spear? Make sure? Okay. Like, we're describing some pretty rough characters in these Roman soldiers, aren't we? And they treated very cruelly. But it turns out, we learn again from John, that this was a fulfillment of prophecy. John writes, "For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken." Not one of his bones were broken. So they didn't break his legs, and even the beatings he took must not have broken a bone. And again, another scripture says they will look on him who they had pierced. And he was pierced by the sword by one of the Roman soldiers. Next slide. Another one? I got ahead of myself, I'm sorry. All right. And we've talked about this before. Crucifixions back in the Roman times were just not all that uncommon. They happened a lot. In fact, it's recorded that one occasion in 71 BC, the Romans crucified 6,000 slaves who were accused of staging a revolt. Can you imagine a scene where 6,000 people were crucified? Who could do that? Well, the Romans could and did in 71 BC.
It's not just the Romans, though. Look back in history.
Yep.
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 Mongols and one of the sects of the Chinese, as they were taking over the country, rather than assimilate the people, they just terminated them all. And they're talking about 15, 20, 25,000 souls.
Bunches of them. Yeah, okay.
That, to me, is incomprehensible.
Yeah. I just think we got to consider it. This is tough to talk about, but we just got to consider what actually took place and what Jesus actually endured on our behalf. But the crucifixion of Jesus on this day was different than the crucifixion of a common criminal. This day would prove to be one the centurion and his men would never forget. We're going to talk about the impact that Jesus had on the centurion. This is one that they would never forget, even though their hearts had been hard for a long time. Next slide. First, there was Jesus' demeanor on the cross. We already said he was reviled and he didn't revile. He was spat upon, he didn't spit back. Oh, he was threatened or he didn't do that. And of course, 1 Peter chapter 2, we read, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So that was noticeable to the centurion, just the way Jesus handled his punishment and his death. The centurion heard Jesus say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We stand amazed that he could say that. He was speaking of these people, these Romans, the battalion that had mocked him, all those that were viewing. And to hear those words come out of Jesus' mouth, which the centurion did, had to be impactful. Think of the impact of hearing the words of Jesus on the cross must have had on this man who had known nothing his whole life except aggression, revenge, and brutality. Like I say, this was a tough soldier. And to hear Jesus say those words, that's certainly not the way the centurion would have reacted. And then, at Jesus' death, complete darkness came across the earth. I'm assuming like never had before and never will again. It says in Matthew 27, now from the 6th hour, that is noon, there was darkness over the land until the 9th hour, which is about 3 p.m. And then Luke adds that the sun's light failed. So what was this darkness? Was it just an ordinary eclipse, solar eclipse? Anybody seen a solar eclipse that lasted 3 hours? How long does a solar eclipse normally last? 15, 30 minutes? Yeah, eclipses only last about 15 minutes, not 3 hours. Another point to be recognized is Christ was crucified during Passover week, which was always observed during the full moon. Always observed during the full moon. And it's said that solar eclipses will only occur during the new moon. So this was a supernatural miracle that God performed. Next slide. So what was the significance of the darkness? Are we told anywhere in Scripture, or do you have any thoughts in that regard? What was the significance of the earth becoming dark for 3 hours at that moment? Any thoughts in that regard? Okay. Kevin says it was symbolic of God abandoning him for a period of time because of the sins of mankind. Okay. That's a good thought. Any other notions there? Anybody else got any thoughts?
I've heard something similar about God turning his back and not wanting to see, anguish. It's just speculation. No scriptures.
That's right. That's right. Whatever we would say would be speculation, I think. One writer writes that the sun refused to shine on its naked creator, writhing in agony and in deeper anguish of soul. Such unusual darkness was nature's sympathy with her suffering Lord. And some have said it may be the fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy found in Amos chapter 8, verse 9. But the fact is, I don't think we're really told. Whatever we think, it would be conjecture. What else? What other miracle happened, that that obviously showed us that God was involved. Ripping of the veil, yes. From the top. What's special about that?
It had to be, how many feet up in the air? And it would have been, other than someone that was like Goliath.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think I've heard, but I don't recall how tall that was. But yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah,
And grasped the cloth.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Plus, it wasn't exactly a thin little
Yeah,
sheer cloth.
yeah. It wouldn't be something that you could do just by like that. And it's obviously, since it was done from the top and not the bottom, it wasn't an act of some vandalism of some sort. So it can be nothing less than an act of God.
You had to be careful
Well,
for the high priest.
sure. Yep.
If he were in there, or if they, they were preparing for the Passover, and you're in their primary place of worship.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, it's almost it had to be tough for whoever discovered that to make realization
Yeah.
that they would actually see.
Right. Uh-huh. Yeah. And that veil was a very valued thing, especially made by, and I think it was stolen a few times by people that would come and conquer because of its value. So what was the significance of the ripping of the veil? I mean, what significance does that have for us as New Testament Christians? Sure. What make your comment though? Yeah. Yeah.
It has to do with opening of the Holy of Holies.
Right.
So now we don't need
Mm-hmm.
a priest anymore. We have a priest who is accessible to everyone and all the time.
Right.
So we don't have the Holy of Holies anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And each of us becomes a priest.
Right. Able to communicate to God. Yeah, that's the point. All right. And so the doing away. In fact, if we read in Hebrews chapter 10, it's explained that the significance of this event, and that's where it argues that it heralded the end of the old covenant and made the cross the new access into the holy place, into God, for all of us. So that was a very significant. Yes, sir, Larry. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. Right. Oh, I can imagine. Yeah. Yeah. So you experienced that in Arkansas, you said? Okay. So you can imagine what these folks, the impact all these miraculous events happening at the time of Jesus' death would have had on these Roman soldiers. Good point. Yes. I didn't hear. Oh, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. 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 In fact, that's the next point. Yes, sir. You got.
I always wondered what it was like out in the little towns, the little synagogues where the old rabbis sat in those little Sanhedrins when word came that the temple veil had been rent.
Yeah.
That, as was pointed out,
Right.
the dead rose,
Mm-hmm.
that it was dark for 3 hours. If I were Rome, I would, whoever I had in stewardship of all those people, I'd be looking for rebellion to happen. Because it's just, that would have been a tipping point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yep.
But he paid it willingly as a sacrifice for the propitiation of our sins.
Well said. Well said. Well, what other event happened at the same time of Jesus' death? You spoke of it, an earthquake, right? An earthquake. Anybody ever been in an earthquake?
Yep.
A big one?
Yep.
How big was it?
Biggest, or the one on February 9th, 1971 in Southern California where the overhead cement,
Northridge?
yeah,
Okay.
when that happened,
Yeah.
in 3 or 4 when I lived out there
Uh-huh.
as a boy, and there is nothing that prepares you
Mm-hmm.
for what you see. Because I saw a fence that was going in 2 directions at once. And it shattered every window. It must have been thousands of them in the school that I went to, and it broke them all differently. Some of them were cracked like you expect them to. Others were cracked from the narrow side through.
Yeah.
There is no escaping it. Let's put it that way.
Right. So it gets your attention is what you're saying. Now, we've had a few little tremors around here, just a little shake, that kind of thing. But nothing like what you're speaking of and what this must have been. Because, yes.
I had another comment about the graves being open.
Yeah, and that's part of this. Please make that comment. That'd be good.
I'm not sure over the years if somebody got a better translation of this, but in the reading it this time, it talks about how that the graves were, well, actually the timeline is kind of sketchy, trying to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
It mentions that these dead saints that came alive didn't come out of the grave until after the resurrection of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then they went in to show them,
Into the holy city, yep. Mm-hmm.
which of course we would be quite frightful.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe in our society, I have a different attitude than the people did at that time. So I do remember reading in the scriptures that there were people who would go and bring people from the dead, and ask them questions. Maybe in there they talk about different other situations where the bones end up having flesh on and things like that, and fighting. And maybe they had a different view of death and resurrection. But for me, the way that I've grown up and thought about it, I would be terrified even if it was a relative
Mm-hmm.
that was given life and taken up and showed themselves to be. I would probably end up being in the grave substituting for.
That's right. Yeah. I understand. It'd be frightening, wouldn't it? We read about that in Matthew 27, verses 51 through 53, if you want to refer to that. But Matthew says that the rocks split, and evidently a number of graves were opened. Later, after Jesus' resurrection, many bodies of the saints ascended from these tombs to testify of Jesus' glory to those living in the holy city. And that's what he was speaking about, timeline and what actually happened. Next slide, please. Yes, another one. Okay. Oh. All right. Maybe we need to go one more slide. What's going on? Another one. Okay, now we're going to see what was the impact. You were talking about the impact on you. You'd have been scared. Okay, well, let's see what it did to the centurion. After the centurion and his men witnessed these astonishing events, a remarkable change came over them. And you would expect that. Put yourself in their shoes. Regardless of what they had believed when they reported to duty that day, they did not go home the same men. They'd seen so much of Jesus, who this person was, how he died, and then all those miracles that took place in conjunction with his death. Next slide. We read that the Bible says that they were filled with awe, A-W-E. And we hear that word used pretty frequently now, awesome. But what does that word really mean? Do what? God inspired, okay. Any other comments on what that means? Matthew in chapter 27 says, when the centurion and those who were with him, I assume it's those 3 soldiers, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe. And the word awe expresses an overwhelming feeling of reverence or even fear produced by something or someone that is sublime and extremely powerful. This is what the centurion felt at the cross. He was overwhelmed with this feeling of awe. And according to Mark, next slide, the centurion stood face to face with Jesus. You know, I always thought in the pictures we get, we've got the cross being lifted up way high, and you're looking up on a hillside, and you know Jesus is the highest, and the thieves are beside him. But they said in reality, contrary to that picture that we see, the Roman crucifix stood about 6 feet from the ground. Remember, your feet were together and pounded together. So it's possible that the centurion was actually standing face to face to Jesus. Okay, and Jesus was saying these things, and he was right there on eye level with him. Think about the further impact of that. This, along with the miraculous activity he had just witnessed, must have created an especially eerie sensation that began to melt the centurion's previously hard heart. And Luke tells us that after all this, the centurion, this tough guy, this mean guy, praised God. If a man will take the time to study and come to an understanding of the cross, which the centurion did, before long he will be saying what Paul said, and that is, thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift. The centurion was a changed man. You recall that Pilate had already said that Jesus was innocent 3 times. 3 times he said, this is an innocent man. Then there was Herod Antipas. Saw no reason to put Jesus to death. And now we see this centurion, who was the very one commissioned to ensure that Jesus was crucified, killed, saying, certainly this man was innocent. These 3 witnesses, serving in official capacities, declared Jesus' innocence. So undoubtedly, Jesus' crucifixion was without a doubt the worst miscarriage of justice in history. Let me repeat that. Without a doubt, his crucifixion was the worst miscarriage of justice in history. Next slide. These are words that are so impressive. When the centurion saw the way Jesus breathed his last, the centurion said, truly, this man was the Son of God. Matthew reveals that all the soldiers who were there made this confession as well. And you remember, this is the good confession that Peter made, that Jesus was the Son of the living God. So, if all we knew about centurions was what we learned from history, we would think they were all ruffians and just military men. It's interesting that, and I'll conclude with this, the Bible casts favorable impressions on the centurions, and let me name 3 of them. One is the centurion that Jesus marveled at and said he had not found such faith in all the nation of Israel. The second one, named Cornelius, was the first Gentile Christian. And now this centurion, and then there was a centurion named Julius that saved Paul from a plan hatched to do him harm. Last point. Perhaps these examples teach us that your title or your station in life doesn't matter. What matters is what God is able to do to your heart, and he was certainly able to do that to the centurions. Thank you for your time, and we'll look forward to next week, Joseph of Arimathea. Let me thank you especially for your participation. Makes my job easier. Thank you much.
Good evening, everybody. If you'll go ahead and come in and have a seat, we'll get started with our devotional time together tonight. Wanted to give you some updates on folks from our prayer list. Continue to remember Sharon Fisher. She had successful hip replacement surgery May 13th, but she's in quite a bit of pain as she recovers from that. Some of you all know that all too well. David Rowland had several tests done today, and he should get those results tomorrow. That was the plan. Hopefully it'll still be the plan to see how well his treatments recently have affected his cancer. Fred Lawson took a trip to Chicago. They've done that stem cell treatment. They should know something about that soon. And then Hector Cortez has been making improvements, so we're thankful for that. He is still in Mexico receiving treatments for that. As far as our family news, one big thing to remember, this coming Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is our gospel meeting. Friday and Saturday night at 6 p.m., we're going to have Dan Winkler here. He is going to be preaching on prayer, and he's an excellent speaker. Like I've said, I've heard some of these lessons before. They're excellent. You will definitely benefit from those. That's going to be Friday at 6, Saturday at 6, and then Sunday morning, all of our adult classes will be here together. And then we'll have our time of worship together, and our Hispanic brethren are going to join us for that. We're going to have a joint worship service, so we always love those. And then we'll have a meal afterwards, and then come right back in here around 12:15, 12:30 to have our devotional service, and there will be no 5 p.m. service on Sunday. So that's all coming up. Remember, check light post, check the bulletin, all those things for the details. Pathfinders, you all have your split devotional tomorrow night in the Lighthouse. Check GroupMe for more information. And the high school senior banquet is this coming Sunday night. I know we don't have service, but we're having the senior banquet at 5 p.m. Some have asked, well, I wanted to bring a gift for the seniors, but since we're not having service that night and that is an invitation-only kind of event, how do I get you can bring those Sunday morning. You can bring those gifts Sunday morning. Andrew's going to have a designated area for you to drop those cards, money. He'll take the money. No, I'm kidding. Put all those things in their correct baskets, right, so that they get them that evening. Just so if you want to bring those Sunday morning, those gifts, they would appreciate it. One last thing is out in the foyer area, you notice a couple of big boxes. Our Pathfinders are collecting clothing. If you would like to donate some clothing, maybe you've kind of been working through your closet and you're like, I don't wear this. This doesn't make me feel good anymore, right? All that stuff. If you want to bring that here, you can drop it in those boxes and they're going to make sure to get that donated very soon. So we're thankful for them wanting to take on that project. Let's help them do that. All right, so leading us in our devotional tonight, Colby's going to be leading us in our singing, Colby Johnson. Bo Pierce is going to have our devotional thought. I love it when Bo does devos. And then Brian Morton is going to dismiss us in prayer at the appropriate time. So Colby, if you'll come, start leading us, brother.
Our first song this evening will be number 959, Just a Little Talk with Jesus. We'll sing all 3 verses. I once was lost in sin, but Jesus took me in and gave the light from heaven, filled my soul. It made my heart in love and wrote my name above, and just a little talk with Jesus made me whole. Let us have a little talk with Jesus. Let us tell him all about our troubles. He will hear our faintest cry. He will answer by and by. When you feel
Good evening. The lesson tonight is going to be kind of based on 1 Corinthians 3rd chapter, verses 9 through 11. Paul and Apollos, have been preaching, and Paul planting, Apollos watering, as we know. It reads, "For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. You are God's building. According to the grace of God, which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it. But let each one take heed how he builds on it. For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ." Tonight I'll make another attempt to extract a heavenly meaning from an earthly story, a parable. I promised some family members they would not be referenced tonight, but I did promise some other West End members that I would reference some more country experiences. I still have a lot to draw from. Levon and I were on Pellissippi Parkway a couple of weeks ago, and we approached and then passed two pickup trucks pulling trailers loaded with square bales of hay. For you city folks, square bales are really rectangular, but smaller bales. I looked at her and said, "There's my next Devo." Many of today's farmers have the equipment to cut, rake, bale, and store hay in large round bales by themselves. You non-farm folks, again, have seen these large round bales in fields as you drive by. That's why it was unusual to see the trailers loaded with square bales. In my first experience with square bales, they were actually tied together with wire, baling wire. But I'm not going back that far. In high school one summer, a friend with a driver's license borrowed his daddy's flatbed truck, and along with a couple of other friends, we went into the hay hauling business. Most farmers could cut, rake, and bale their hay, but they couldn't get it to the barn without help. That's where we came in. The hourly minimum wage in 1964 was $1.25. We got a penny per bale to get the hay from the field to stacked in the barn. We could get 110 bales on the truck. Properly stacked, we could get 110 bales on the truck. You've probably done the math. That was $1 and a dime for each of us from the field to stacked in the barn. For young teenagers to be almost making minimum wage at that time was potentially pretty good. And it was good exercise to keep me in football shape over the summer. Occasionally we would get a job on a farm that had a lot of hay and fields that were pretty close to the barn. If we really hustled, we could get 2 loads to the barn in an hour, $2.20 per hour. Not bad back then. But it was summer, very hot working conditions. The lofts of the barn under those tin roofs would often approach 120 degrees. Some areas of Giles County were home to rattlesnakes, other areas to copperheads. More than once we lifted a bale to find a snake under it in the cool dirt. But $1 and a dime a truckload and the hope of $2.20 per hour kept us going, along with a stop at Donovan's Country Store for an ice-cold Sundrop in a glass bottle. 5 cents if you drank it there, 7 cents with a 2-cent deposit on the bottle if you took it with you. 5 cents. That was 5 bales of hay, but it hit the spot. To get 110 bales on the truck, you needed an experienced stacker. One drove Two of us walked alongside the truck and tossed hay onto the truck, and the stacker would carefully lay the foundation for the load, starting at the front and working to the rear while stacking 5 levels high. The stacker laid out an alternating pattern in such a way to tie the bales together and secure 110 bales of hay. An efficient work of art, probably employing some engineering practices, but we didn't know that then. If you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, walk back to the pallets of cinder blocks. If the blocks were just stacked straight up on top of each other, they would fall over. They are stacked in a crosshatch pattern to tie them together. One day we were on a hilly farm near Linville, Tennessee. A dry creek bed ran between some hills. We had completed several truckloads successfully, but it was getting late and we were getting tired. The last load was on one of the farthest hills from the barn. We got the truck loaded with the last 110 bales. Rather than take the much longer dirt road to the barn, which had a little bridge across a dry creek bed, the driver, it was his truck, against my advice, decided on a shortcut alongside the hillside pastures and across the dry creek bed. 2 in the cab, 2 of us on top of the hay. Our driver assured us he would go slowly and carefully, and he did until he got to the creek bed. He eased the front tires off the truck and into the creek bed. So far, so good. He eased along, and then the rear tires suddenly dropped 2-3 feet in the creek bed. Me and my buddy and a lot of the hay hung in the air while the driver continued to ease along. In a few seconds, the truck was out of the creek bed, but me and my buddy and a lot of the hay were bouncing on the ground. Thankfully, we were not hurt, but we had a problem. After a heated business meeting, it was decided to just throw the hay back on the truck as quickly as possible, not take time to restack it from the bed up. This was accomplished, and we eased along the hillside toward the barn, with me and my buddy standing on the running boards this time. We were about halfway to the barn when the load started shifting downhill, and we lost much of the top levels again. To make what probably is too long a story a little shorter, we piled the hay back on the truck, lost it a third time before we got it stacked in the barn. Remember, a penny a bale from the field to the barn. We loaded that hay 4 times before we got it to the barn, and we still earned $1 and a dime for that load. So what's the point? Our spiritual life is kind of like that load of hay. If we build a solid foundation based on the pattern described in God's Word, our spiritual journey will have a much better chance of holding up through life's hillsides, dirt roads, dry creek beds, and the temptations of shortcuts. Remember the 2 trucks on Pellissippi pulling identical trailers loaded with hay? The lead trailer's load was stacked well on a good foundation. The following trailer's load had shifted considerably. I would have liked to have followed them. I imagine that first trailer made it to the barn just fine. I'm not so sure about the second one. So, if you need to start your spiritual journey tonight, Jesus has laid your foundation, a solid foundation. He is the master builder, or haystacker, if you will. And his precious blood is what ties us together. Or if your foundation has been shifted on your journey by hillsides, shortcuts, bumps in the road, and unsuccessful attempts to restack on your own, ask Jesus to rebuild your foundation tonight. We'll pray with you, If we can help you any way, let's stand and come forward while we sing.
Standing on the corner.